The night was perfect, a spectacle of luxury and power where everything seemed meticulously orchestrated. But behind the toasts and smiles, an invisible tension pulsed, ready to explode. When the host's wife refuses to follow the script, a simple act of rebellion becomes the spark for a scandal. What seemed to be just a gala dinner soon becomes the stage for an inevitable ruin, and a truth that no one could ever imagine. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing, Eleanor adjusted her emerald green silk dress for the 10th time in front of the mirror. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the delicate pearl necklace, a poisoned gift from her mother-in-law, Mrs. Barbara Blackwell. The reflection showed a 35-year-old woman, elegant and refined, exactly as they expected her to be. But her eyes, once resigned, now held a silent determination that no one had yet noticed. "Ma'am, the guests are already arriving." The voice of Martha, her housekeeper, and only true confidant in that mansion, brought her back to reality. "Thank you, Martha. Is everything prepared as we discussed?" Eleanor asked in a low voice, even knowing they were alone in the room. "Yes, ma'am, every detail." The housekeeper hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Eleanor took a deep breath, touching the hidden flash drive in her evening bag. There was her entire future, all the evidence she had patiently collected over the past 3 years. Documents, emails, recordings, every small piece of evidence of her husband's, Richard Blackwell's, obscure activities, and the corrupt empire built by his family. "I've never been more certain in my life, Martha." The main hall of the Blackwell mansion was already buzzing with the cream of New York society. Businessmen, politicians, celebrities, all orbiting around Richard, who commanded the environment with his usual calculated charm. Tall, always impeccably dressed in tailored Italian suits, he was the very personification of power. Mrs. Barbara, his mother, circulated among the guests like a queen in her domain. At 65, she maintained the haughty posture and penetrating gaze that made everyone bow to her will. It was she who had orchestrated Richard's marriage to Eleanor 10 years ago, seeing in the young woman from a traditional but economically declining family the perfect daughter-in-law, beautiful, educated, and most importantly, manipulable. Eleanor descended the main staircase with the grace that years of etiquette had taught her. Smiles were exchanged, superficial greetings repeated like a well-rehearsed ritual. No one there could see beyond the carefully constructed facade, beyond the image of the perfect wife of the powerful Richard Blackwell. "Darling, you look absolutely stunning." Richard greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Do you remember the speech we prepared?" "Every word, love," Eleanor replied, holding his gaze with a confidence that, for a brief moment, seemed to unsettle him. The dinner was proceeding exactly as planned. French champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the hall, and everyone seemed immersed in that bubble of privilege and power. Eleanor observed every detail, every person, every reaction. There were all those who, for years, had pretended not to see her golden cage, who had ignored the signs of her suffering in the name of appearances and self-interest. Mrs. Barbara rose from her chair, signaling the moment everyone had been waiting for. It was tradition that at important events, Eleanor would give a speech extolling her husband's qualities and the Blackwell family's achievements. A ritual of submission disguised as a tribute. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Barbara's voice sounded sweet, but her eyes conveyed a clear order. With smooth movements, Eleanor stood up. The hall fell silent in expectation. Richard smiled, satisfied, while his mother watched every movement of her daughter-in-law with the eyes of a hawk. The moment Eleanor had planned for so long had finally arrived. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice came out clear, firm, surprising even herself. "Tonight is a special night, not only for the celebration that brings us together here, but because I can finally share with you some truths that need to be told." The silence in the hall took on a new quality. It was no longer the respectful reverence of always, but a palpable tension that grew with each second. Eleanor could feel Richard's gaze upon her, first confused, then gradually transforming into something more dangerous. "As you all know," she continued, her voice gaining strength, The Blackwells are known for their influence and power. What few know are the methods used to build and maintain this empire. Mrs. Barbara stood up abruptly, her face a mask of contained fury. Eleanor, dear, I think the champagne is affecting your judgment. Perhaps it's better. No, Mrs. Barbara, for the first time you're going to listen to me. Eleanor interrupted her with a firmness that surprised everyone. For 10 years, I've been the perfect wife you molded. I smiled at the right parties, said the right words, pretended not to see the betrayals, the schemes, the manipulations. The murmur began to spread through the hall. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others watched the scene with morbid interest. Richard stood up, his face red with anger. Eleanor, that's enough, his voice thundered through the room. No, Richard, it's not enough. Do you know what I found in your office 3 years ago? She pulled the flash drive from her purse. Very interesting documents about how you and your mother got that bid for the new airport project. Or maybe we should talk about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Richard's face paled. Mrs. Barbara, in turn, maintained a studied, calm though her eyes betrayed her growing panic. You really thought I was that naive, that I didn't notice the secret meetings, the suspicious phone calls, the documents being destroyed in the middle of the night? Eleanor continued, her voice now laden with bitter irony. Among the guests, Eleanor identified familiar faces that were beginning to show signs of nervousness. Businessmen who had participated in the schemes, politicians who had received bribes, all present in their web of corruption. My dear daughter-in-law, Mrs. Barbara tried to regain control of the situation, her mellifluous voice hiding a veiled threat. Clearly you're confused. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private. Confused? No, Mrs. Barbara, for the first time in a long time I'm seeing everything with absolute clarity. How you manipulated your own son since childhood, turning him into your puppet. How you orchestrated my marriage to him, not out of affection, but because you needed a presentable figure to distract society from your shady business. Richard advanced towards Eleanor, his eyes flashing with hatred. The abrupt movement caused several guests to stand up, tense with what might happen. You have no idea what you're doing, he hissed through clenched teeth. On the contrary, I know exactly what I'm doing. Every document on this flash drive has already been sent to strategic people, journalists, prosecutors, authorities who aren't in your pocket. In a few minutes, the whole country will know the true face of the Blackwells. Chaos broke out in the hall. Guests began to stand up, some trying to leave discreetly, others openly running for the exit. Phones were pulled out. Hastily, desperate calls being made. Eleanor watched it all with a surreal calm, as if watching a play she was no longer part of. She saw the exact moment when it dawned on Richard, when he realized his world was crumbling. Mrs. Barbara, always calculating, was already on the phone, probably trying to activate her emergency contacts. But Eleanor knew it would be in vain. She had waited too long, meticulously planned every detail. There was no way to contain the avalanche she had just unleashed. You'll regret this, Richard threatened, his voice trembling with anger. No, Richard. The only regret I have is having taken so long to do this, Eleanor replied, maintaining her composure even when he moved even closer. The sound of glasses breaking echoed through the hall when Richard, in a fit of rage, knocked over the nearest table. Eleanor didn't move even when some wine splashed stained her emerald green dress. Years of fear had transformed into an unshakable strength. Mrs. Blackwell, the deep voice of Senator Robert Anderson cut through the chaotic environment. I suggest you control your son immediately, or I'll be forced to withdraw and take with me all the support I've been offering your family. Mrs. Barbara, who until then had maintained a haughty posture, tasted the bitter flavor of defeat. Her empire was beginning to crumble, and she knew better than anyone how a single piece out of place could bring down the entire house of cards she had built over decades. Eleanor, dear, she tried one last time, her voice now almost pleading. We can resolve this as a family. Think about the scandal, the consequences. Consequences? Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. Like the consequences I suffered when I tried to talk about Richard's infidelities, or when I questioned the origin of the money that financed the expansion of the companies. You locked me in a clinic, claiming I was emotionally unstable. Murmurs of shock ran through the hall. Among those present, Socialite Carmen Villela, who had always boasted of her friendship with the Blackwells, covered her mouth with her hands, horrified. She had visited Eleanor in that clinic, bringing flowers and pretending to believe the official story. "But you know what you didn't realize, Mrs. Barbara," Eleanor continued, pulling a second flash drive from her purse. "While you kept me isolated, I had access to something very valuable. Time. Time to think, to plan, to gather true allies." Martha, the housekeeper, watched everything from a discreet corner of the hall, a small smile of satisfaction on her lips. For years, she had been Eleanor's eyes and ears inside the mansion, documenting every irregularity, every suspicious conversation. "You are nothing without this family," Richard vociferated, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Who's going to believe you against us?" "I believe," a female voice sounded from the entrance of the hall. Everyone turned to see Sophia Blackwell, Richard's younger sister, who had been estranged from the family for years due to inappropriate behavior. Sophia walked through the hall with the same characteristic elegance of the Blackwells, but her eyes revealed a hardness acquired in the battles she had fought against her own family. "And I'm not alone." Behind her entered two men that Mrs. Barbara recognized immediately. One was Robert Torres, the family's former accountant who had been fired and threatened after questioning certain transactions, and the other was John Paul Silva, a respected investigative journalist. "How dare you?" Mrs. Barbara hissed at her daughter. "After everything we've done for you?" "Everything you've done for me?" Sophia laughed humorlessly. "Like trying to institutionalize me when I discovered the documents about sabotaging Dad's company, or how you manipulated his will after the accident." Eleanor watched the color drain from Mrs. Barbara's face. That was a revelation that not even she knew. The Blackwell empire had even more rotten foundations than she had imagined. Among the few guests who still remained in the hall, cell phones began to ring frantically. The news was already leaking to the press. Outside the mansion, some camera flashes could already be seen through the windows. "It's over, Mrs. Barbara," Eleanor declared with surprising calm. "You can keep trying to manipulate the situation, but the truth has longer legs than your lies." The next few hours unfolded like a whirlwind. The Blackwell mansion, once the stage for so many displays of power, was now transforming into the epicenter of a social earthquake that shook the foundations of New York's high society. Outside, a small crowd of journalists had already gathered, attracted by the rumors spreading on social media. Sophia Blackwell approached Eleanor, ignoring her mother's furious glares. "We need to talk in private. There are more things you need to know." The two women headed to Richard's office, followed by Martha, the housekeeper, who strategically positioned herself near the door. On the way, they crossed paths with several guests who were practically running to their limousines, fearing being associated with the imminent scandal. "You were smarter than I was," Sophia began, a sad smile playing on her lips. "When I tried to expose the truth 5 years ago, I was impulsive, emotional. They destroyed me with ease." Eleanor observed her sister-in-law with new eyes. The black sheep of the Blackwell family had always been portrayed as a troubled and unstable young woman. Now she saw in her an unexpected ally who carried her own scars. "Why did you decide to show up today?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "Because I was waiting for someone to have the courage I didn't have to finish what I started." Sophia pulled out a laptop from her bag. "And because I have information that complements yours. You know that accident that took our father? It wasn't an accident." Downstairs, Mrs. Barbara was commanding a frantic damage control operation. Around her, press officers were desperately trying to contain the leak of information, while lawyers were being called in emergency calls. "We need to focus on discrediting." "Eleanor," she instructed, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Highlight her history in the clinic. Suggest that she's mentally unstable, driven by jealousy and revenge." Richard, in turn, was in his own personal hell. Sitting in a corner of the hall, he was beginning to realize that his entire life had been built on lies. Lies from his mother, lies he himself had told, lies that now threatened to suffocate him. Back in the office, Sophia was showing Eleanor a series of old emails. Mom was always the true force behind the Blackwells. Dad was just the public face, the charismatic man everyone admired. When he started questioning some deals, when he threatened to expose certain irregularities.
She silenced him, Eleanor completed, feeling a shiver run down her spine. Exactly, and Richard, he's just another one of her creations, molded from childhood to be the perfect puppet. A scream of anger from the lower floor interrupted the conversation.
It was Richard, who had apparently just received a devastating call. The shares of Blackwell Incorporated have just plummeted on the stock market, Martha informed, entering the office. And the Federal Reserve has just announced a special investigation into all the group's financial operations. Eleanor felt a contradictory mix of emotions. She had planned her revenge for years, but the real dimension of the consequences was beginning to hit her. It wasn't just the end of the Blackwells, it was the beginning of an earthquake that would shake the foundations of the American elite. "Are you sure you're prepared for what's coming?" Sophia asked, as if reading her thoughts. "They're going to try to destroy you in every possible way." "I am," Eleanor responded firmly, "but I need your help. Together, we can ensure that the whole truth comes to light, not just convenient parts of it." A sound of breaking glass downstairs was followed by more screams. Mrs. Barbara's voice sounded hysterical, ordering someone to do something, anything, to contain the approaching tsunami. Dawn found the Blackwell mansion in a state of controlled chaos. The gardens, normally immaculate, were taken over by journalists and photographers. Inside the house, staff circulated nervously, while tense conversations took place in different rooms. Eleanor observed everything from her old suite, now transformed into a kind of headquarters. Beside her, Sophia organized documents while they watched the first headlines explode on the morning news. Blackwell Incorporated under investigation. Scandal shakes financial market. Family empire built on systematic corruption. Heiress reveals millionaire fraud scheme. "You should have seen the face of the board of directors," Sophia commented, hanging up a call on her cell phone. "They're calling an emergency meeting for 10 a.m. Some shareholders are already demanding Richard's immediate removal." Martha entered the room carrying a breakfast tray, which neither of the two women touched. "Mrs. Barbara has been in the office since 5 a.m. with the lawyers. And Mr. Richard, well, he hasn't left the guest room. On the lower floor, the main office had been transformed into a war room. Mrs. Barbara, still wearing her dress from the night before, but with no sign of fatigue on her made-up face, was coordinating a team of lawyers and advisors. "I want all offshore accounts transferred immediately," she ordered on the phone. "And cancel any suspicious movements from the last 48 hours. No, I don't care how you're going to do it. Just do it." Eleanor's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from John Paul Silver, the investigative journalist. "First part of the story goes on air in 30 minutes. Prepare for the repercussions." "Sophia," Eleanor called her sister-in-law, "I think it's time we show the evidence about your father." The two women exchanged significant looks. That would be the final play, the revelation that would not only destroy the Blackwell's reputation, but also expose Mrs. Barbara's true face. In the guest room, Richard finally emerged from his alcoholic stupor to the sound of another notification on his cell phone. It was a message from the chairman of the board. "Your presence is excused from the meeting. Your executive powers are temporarily suspended." The reality of the situation finally hit him with full force. It wasn't just a crisis. That could be circumvented with money and influence. It was the end of everything he knew, of everything he believed to be. In the garden, Robert Torres, the former accountant, was giving a bombshell interview. All the overpriced contracts went through a complex money laundering scheme. Mrs. Barbara personally supervised each operation. The Blackwell matriarch watched the interview on the TV in her office, her face a mask of controlled fury. Decades of manipulation and control were slipping through her fingers like fine sand. "Ma'am," one of the lawyers approached hesitantly, "we've just received a summons. The FBI is on its way with a search and seizure warrant." It was at this moment that something inside Mrs. Barbara seemed to break. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a plan B. There was no carefully planned strategic exit. Eleanor and Sophia, from the top of the staircase, observed the growing movement of people entering and leaving the mansion. Older employees were beginning to discreetly leave their posts, anticipating the inevitable. Some carried boxes with personal belongings, others simply left in silence. Do you think she'll try something desperate? Sophia asked, knowing her. Mother too well to underestimate her. I'm sure she will, Eleanor replied. That's why we need to act first. It's time to release the last part of our dossier. The FBI helicopter hovered over the Blackwell mansion while police cars approached through the main gates. Inside the house, chaos had reached its peak. Employees ran from one side to the other, some hastily destroying documents, others simply abandoning their work posts. They can't enter the basement, Mrs. Barbara frantically ordered her head of security. No one can access that area. Understood? Eleanor and Sophia exchanged significant looks upon hearing this order. The mansion's basement, supposedly a storage area, had always been a mystery even to family members. Martha, Eleanor discreetly called the housekeeper, do you still have access to the security system? The housekeeper nodded, showing a small device in her hands. For years she had kept a master copy of all the mansion's electronic keys, preparing for this moment. We need to reach the basement before they destroy everything, Sophia whispered. That's where Dad kept his private safe, the one Mom never managed to open. In the main office, Richard finally confronted his mother, years of manipulation and lies coming to the surface in an explosion of anger and frustration. You turned me into this, he shouted, knocking objects off his desk. Every decision in my life, every choice, and it was all you. Mrs. Barbara stared at him with a mixture of contempt and pity. You would never have made it on your own, Richard. You were too weak, too sensitive. I made you strong. Strong, he laughed bitterly. You made me your puppet. Even my marriage to Eleanor was your idea, your manipulation. While the argument continued on the upper floor, Eleanor, Sophia, and Martha discreetly descended to the basement. The environment was cold and silent, illuminated only by emergency lights. There, Sophia pointed to a steel door at the end of the corridor. The safe is behind that false wall. Martha passed the device over the electronic reader, and the eSIM source door opened with a soft click. The interior revealed a room that seemed straight out of a spy movie, walls filled with files, old computers, and at the back, a wall that clearly hid something more. Quick, Eleanor urged, hearing movement above them. The FBI must already be entering the house. Sophia approached the false wall, her fingers sliding over the surface until she found a hidden mechanism. With a soft creak, the panel moved, revealing a built-in safe. The password? She murmured, her eyes glistening with contained tears. Dad always said that when the time came, I would know. Her hands trembled as she typed a sequence of numbers on the electronic panel. It was her birth date, but not in the conventional format. It was the day her father always said his life had truly begun. The safe opened with a hiss, revealing its contents: an external hard drive, documents yellowed by time, and a sealed envelope with the inscription, "For my daughters, when the truth comes to light." Hurried footsteps echoed down the stairs. Mrs. Barbara appeared at the door, her face contorted into a mask of fury at seeing the open safe. "Get away from there. Immediately," she ordered, her voice trembling with anger. "It's over, Mom," Sophia said calmly, holding her father's envelope. "There's nothing more you can do." At that moment, FBI agents flooded the basement, their footsteps echoing through the concrete corridor. Mrs. Barbara Blackwell, the woman who for decades had controlled an empire through manipulation and fear, saw her world crumble before her eyes. The living room of the Blackwell mansion, once the stage for so many displays of power, now served as the operations center for the FBI. Agents came and went, cataloging documents and equipment. At the center of it all, Eleanor and Sophia sat side by side, the envelope left by their father between them. "Ms. Blackwell," a detective approached Sophia, "we need your authorization to access the files on the hard drive found in the safe." Sophia nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on the envelope she hadn't yet had the courage to open. Eleanor gently placed her hand over hers. "Together?" she asked softly. With trembling fingers, Sophia broke the seal. Inside there was a handwritten letter and several old photographs. The firm handwriting of Albert Blackwell filled several pages, telling a story that would forever change their understanding of their family. "My beloved daughters," Sophia began to read aloud, her voice choked. "If you're reading this letter, it means that finally the truth has come to light. Barbara wasn't always the woman you knew. There was a time when we were truly happy, when power and ambition hadn't corrupted her soul. Eleanor observed her sister-in-law with a new look, realizing for the first time how much she resembled her father in the old photographs. In one of them, a young Barbara genuinely smiled, holding a baby, Richard, in her arms, while Albert watched them with adoration. I discovered the first signs of the diversions in 1995, the letter continued. Small irregularities that grew, transforming into a complex scheme of corruption. When I confronted Barbara, she had already changed too much. Power had become her only reason for living. Upstairs, Richard was sitting in his old room, surrounded by police officers who were searching every drawer, every closet. His father's. Words echoed through the house's internal sound system, as Sophia had decided that everyone present needed to hear the truth. I tried to protect you. Sophia's voice trembled as she read. Especially you, Sophia, who was always more sensitive, more like me. I knew Barbara would try to mold you in her image, turn you into pieces of her power game. With Richard, unfortunately, she succeeded. In her makeshift cell in the office, Mrs. Barbara listened to every word, her face an impassive mask. Only her eyes, brimming with tears she refused to shed, betrayed any emotion. The accident that took my life wasn't accidental, the letter continued, provoking a sepulchral silence in the mansion. I discovered documents that proved Barbara's involvement in a much larger scheme, which involved high-ranking politicians and powerful businessmen. I planned to expose everything, but she found out. Martha, the housekeeper, quietly approached Eleanor, handing her a glass of water. Their eyes met, decades of shared secrets passing silently between them. But I couldn't. Gather the courage to expose the truth, Sophia continued reading, tears now freely running down her face. The fear of destroying our family, of harming my children, that fear paralyzed me. It was my greatest weakness, my biggest regret. Eleanor held her sister-in-law's hand tightly, feeling the weight of those words. How many lives had been affected? By silence, by fear, by manipulation. That's why my daughters, the letter went on, I left all the necessary evidence in this safe, not just about the business crimes, but about everything. The hard drive contains files, recordings, documents that prove every irregularity, every manipulation, and more importantly, it contains the truth about my end. The detective coordinating the operation approached, holding a tablet that showed the first files recovered from the hard drive, his eyebrows raised in surprise at seeing the content. This is much bigger than we imagined, he murmured, making quick notes. The afternoon was falling over New York when the first police vehicles began to leave the Blackwell mansion. The sky, painted in shades of orange and purple, seemed to reflect the drama that had unfolded over the last 24 hours. Inside the house, the silence was broken only by the sound of occasional footsteps and the distant hum of investigative equipment. Richard, after hearing his father's entire letter, had asked to speak with Eleanor and Sophia. They found him in the Winter Garden, a space his mother rarely frequented, and which, perhaps for that very reason, still retained something of the house's old soul. I always knew, he began, his voice hoarse from so much crying. Somewhere inside. Me, I always knew something was wrong, but it was easier to pretend, more comfortable to accept the lies. Eleanor observed the man before her, no longer the powerful businessman, no longer the controlling husband, just a son who finally saw the truth about his own history. Why did you never tell me about your suspicions regarding Dad? Sophia asked, sitting next to her brother. Because I was afraid, he admitted, running his hands over his tired face. Afraid of discovering that our mother, that she could, and also because she always knew exactly how to control me. Every compliment, every criticism was calculated to keep me in her orbit. In the main office, now transformed into a deposition room, Martha was giving her testimony. Years of serving the family had given her access to conversations, documents, and situations that now revealed themselves as crucial pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Barbara began to change after she effectively took control of the companies, she reported. At first it was small things, an altered document here, a political favor there. But over time she convinced herself that she was above the laws, above common morality. Eleanor, who was observing the testimony through the glass, felt a chill as she remembered her first years in the mansion. How she had been gradually isolated, her attempts at independence subtly undermined, until she found herself completely enveloped in her mother-in-law's web of manipulation. "Ladies," the detective interrupted her thoughts, approaching with more documents. "The technicians have just decrypted a specific folder on the hard drive. You need to see this." The images on the computer screen showed a sequence of emails and bank transfers that directly linked Mrs. Barbara to a series of shady negotiations. But what really caught their attention was an audio file, dated the day before the accident that claimed Albert Blackwell's life. With trembling hands, Sophia pressed play. Her father's voice filled the room. "Barbara, this has to stop. I can't go along with these schemes anymore. Tomorrow I'm going to the FBI." The recording continued with the sound of a heated argument, culminating in a veiled threat from Barbara that now, in light of events, sounded like a confession. "How did he manage to record this?" Eleanor whispered, impressed by her father-in-law's foresight. "Dad was always smarter than Mum imagined," Sophia replied, a sad smile playing on her lips. "He must have suspected that something like this could happen." Upstairs, Richard had locked himself in his father's old room, a space that had remained practically untouched since his departure. Among the preserved belongings, he found an old diary, its pages yellowed by time containing observations and concerns that now made painful sense. "Eleanor," he called through the internal intercom, his voice choked. "I think you and Sophia need to see this too. There are things here, things that explain a lot about what happened afterwards." A week after the revelations at the Blackwell Mansion, New York was still buzzing with the developments of the scandal. Albert's diary had proven to be a fundamental piece, not only for understanding the past, but also for charting a new future for those who had survived the destruction of the empire. Eleanor was in her new apartment, a modest but cozy space in Brooklyn, organizing the latest discoveries. Albert's diary had revealed not only his suspicions and fears, but also a meticulous plan to protect the family's true heritage, the one built legitimately before Barbara began her manipulations. "He created a parallel structure," Sophia explained, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea in her hands. "Smaller companies, clean investments, all documented and separated from the shady businesses that Mom developed." "Your father was brilliant," Martha commented, now no longer as a housekeeper but as a friend and confidant. "He knew that one day everything would come to light and wanted to ensure a future for you." On the other side of the city, Richard was participating in his first therapy session. The discovery of his father's diary had triggered a deep reflection on his own life, his choices, and the weight of the manipulation he had suffered since childhood. "I always thought strength meant control," he confided to the therapist, "but now I realize that I was the one who was always under control. Every decision I made, every person I hurt, all to please a woman who never knew how to truly love." At the FBI headquarters, a specialized team continued analyzing the documents found in the safe. The revealed scheme was much larger than they had initially imagined, involving high-ranking politicians, powerful businessmen, and an international network of corruption. "Your denunciation triggered the largest anti-corruption operation of the year," the detective informed Eleanor during a meeting. "The documents left by your father-in-law, combined with the evidence that you and Sophia collected, are irrefutable." In her cell at the women's penitentiary, Mrs. Barbara received a visit from her lawyer. Her face, once marked by unshakable arrogance, now showed the signs of time and the weight of her actions. "They found everything," the lawyer informed, uncomfortable. "Albert's diary, the documents in the safe, the recordings. There's no way to deny your involvement." For the first time in decades, Barbara Blackwell felt something she had forgotten existed: regret. Not for the crimes committed or the lost empire, but for having destroyed her own family in the name of power. In Eleanor's apartment, Sophia leafed through the last pages of her father's diary, finding a passage that seemed especially significant. "The true legacy is not in the material goods or the power we accumulate. It's in the lives we touch, the people we love, the choices we make when no one is looking. I hope one day my children will understand this." Eleanor watched the city through the window, reflecting on how her life had changed. The revenge she had planned for so long had transformed into something bigger, a chance for redemption, not just for her but for all those involved. "What do we do now?" Sophia asked, gently closing the diary. "Rebuild," Eleanor replied simply. "Not just the legitimate businesses your father protected, but mainly our lives, without lies, without manipulations." Martha smiled, remembering something Albert used to say, "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." A year had passed since the night that forever changed the fate of the Blackwell family. The old mansion, once a symbol of power and opulence, had been transformed into a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and psychological abuse, a decision made jointly by Eleanor, Sophia, and, surprisingly, Richard. It was an autumn afternoon when the three reunited again in the Winter Garden, now renovated and open to the public. The space, which had once witnessed so many conspiracies and secrets, now served as a place of healing and hope for others. "Dad would be proud," Sophia commented, watching a group of women leaving a group therapy session. "We've transformed all that poison into something positive." Eleanor, who now directed the foundation, had found her true calling. Her personal experience, combined with a deep understanding of the mechanisms of manipulation and abuse, had made her a respected voice on the subject. "Sometimes I wonder if this was what your father wanted from the beginning," she reflected. "Not just to expose the truth, but to give us the chance to do something meaningful with it." Richard, who had spent the last few months in intense therapeutic work, showed a remarkable transformation. The arrogant and controlling man had given way to someone more reflective, more aware of his actions and their consequences. "I found the old social projects that Dad kept secret," he shared, leafing through an old folder. They were genuine initiatives, things he really believed in. Before Mum turned everything into marketing and power tools, Martha, who had chosen to remain as the foundation's administrator, entered the garden bringing special correspondence. The first edition of the book Eleanor had written, telling her story and that of so many other women who found the strength to free themselves. "The launch will be next week," Eleanor announced, running her fingers over the book's cover, "and part of the profits will go directly to expanding the Foundation's programs." In the penitentiary, Mrs. Barbara received her final sentence. The years of crimes and manipulations would result in a long confinement. But the real punishment, as she herself had admitted in a letter sent to her children, was realizing too late how much she had lost in her insatiable pursuit of power. "You were stronger than I ever was," she had written. "You found in truth and transparency the strength that I erroneously sought in control and manipulation." The sun was beginning to set when Sophia found, hidden between the pages of her father's diary, a last message hastily written shortly before his departure. "True love doesn't control, doesn't manipulate, doesn't suffocate. It liberates, strengthens, allows each one to find their own path. It took me too long to learn this, and I paid a high price for my blindness. But you, my children, still have time to do differently." Eleanor watched the sky turn pink and gold through the Winter Garden. Windows. Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from the Women's Support Center, informing that 3 more people had found the courage to seek help that day. "You know," she said, turning to Sophia and Richard, "your father was right. True power isn't in the control we exert over others, but in the ability to transform pain into healing, fear into hope. And in the courage to start over," Sophia completed, smiling. Richard, who for so long had sought his mother's approval, finally understood that his true strength lay in being who he really was, not who others wanted him to be. Night was falling over New York, and with it, the certainty that some stories don't end with a simple revenge or justice, but with the possibility of reconstruction and renewal. The Blackwell Empire had crumbled, but from its ashes something much more valuable was born, the chance to make a difference in other people's lives. "To truth," Eleanor raised her teacup in an improvised toast. "To freedom," Sophia added. "To transformation," Richard completed. And there, in the Winter Garden where everything had begun to change, 3 people whom fate had united through pain finally found their path to the light.